Before we dive in, a quick but important disclaimer. I am not a medical professional. This video is for informational and entertainment purposes only, based on publicly available data and research. It is not medical advice. Please consult with a qualified healthcare provider for any medical concerns or before making any decisions about your health or treatment. Something is happening in America, a change so fast and so profound that we're struggling to even comprehend its scale. It's a story unfolding not in Silicon Valley or on Wall Street, but in our doctors' offices, our pharmacies, and around our dinner tables. And it all revolves around a single class of drugs. In the last quarter of last year, doctors in the United States wrote over 9 million prescriptions for Ozempic and its sister drugs. 9 million. In just 3 months. That's more than the entire population of New York City. A decade ago, almost no one had heard of these medications. Today, they are a cultural and economic force of nature. So how did we get here? How did a diabetes treatment become the most talked about drug on the planet, sparking a modern-day gold rush and fundamentally changing the conversation about weight in America? That is the central question we are going to answer. In this analysis, we are cutting through the noise. We're ignoring the Hollywood rumors and the sensational headlines to dig into the hard data. We'll use publicly available prescription numbers, pharmaceutical company earnings reports, and clinical trial data to piece together the real story. We're going to uncover who is taking these drugs, where they're taking them, and what their explosive rise reveals about our country's health, our economy, and our society. This isn't just a story about a new drug. It's a story about a deep, unmet need in America and a technological solution that arrived at the perfect moment. To truly understand the explosion of Ozempic, Zepbound, and Wegovy, you first have to understand the 40 years of failure that preceded them. For decades, the United States has been fighting a losing battle. We called it the war on obesity, and it was a catastrophic failure. Since 1980, the obesity rate in the U.S. has more than doubled. Today, more than 42% of American adults are considered obese, with another 30% overweight. That's nearly 3/4 of the entire adult population. Think about the sheer scale of the industry that grew up around this crisis. The weight loss market in the U.S. is a behemoth, valued at over $75 billion a year. It's an endless parade of fad diets, from Atkins to keto to paleo. It's gym memberships that go unused, and a multi-billion-dollar supplement industry making promises it almost never keeps. It's celebrity-endorsed workout plans and a relentless media cycle that told us over and over again that the answer was simple: eat less, move more. It was a question of willpower, a failure of character. This message was drilled into the American psyche. If you couldn't lose weight, it was your fault. You were lazy. You lacked discipline. This created a profound sense of shame and failure for millions of people who were genuinely trying. They were counting calories, they were running on treadmills, they were doing everything they were told to do. And for the vast majority, it didn't work. Or if it did, it didn't last. The cycle was brutal. A period of intense restriction and deprivation, followed by a few lost pounds, only to have the weight come roaring back, often with a few extra pounds for good measure. Biologically, the human body is a fortress designed to defend its weight. When you lose weight through calorie restriction, your metabolism slows down and hunger hormones surge, creating an almost irresistible biological imperative to regain what was lost. The willpower narrative completely ignored this fundamental biology. People weren't failing the diets were failing them. And medicine didn't have a good answer. The history of weight loss drugs is littered with disasters. Remember Funfin in the 90s? It was pulled from the market after being linked to serious heart valve damage. Other drugs had marginal effectiveness, unpleasant side effects, or both. For doctors, it was frustrating. They could see the downstream effects of obesity everywhere. The soaring rates of type 2 diabetes, heart disease, stroke, certain types of cancer. But they had very few effective tools to offer their patients beyond eat less, move more. The problem was a raging inferno, and all medicine could offer was a squirt gun. So you have this perfect storm brewing for decades. A massive and growing public health crisis. A population of millions of people desperate for a solution, tired of being blamed and shamed. A multi-billion-dollar industry that consistently overpromised and underdelivered. And a medical establishment that was largely powerless to help. The stage was set. The world was waiting for a breakthrough. It just had no idea what that breakthrough would look like or where it would come from. The answer didn't come from a weight loss lab. Came almost by accident from the world of diabetes research. Scientists have been studying a group of hormones in the gut called incretins. One of these, called glucagon-like peptide 1 or GLP-1, was particularly interesting. When we eat, our gut releases GLP-1 and it does a few remarkable things. It tells the pancreas to release insulin, which helps control blood sugar. This is obviously fantastic for people with type 2 diabetes. But it also does something else. It sends a signal directly to the brain, specifically to the hypothalamus, the part of your brain that controls appetite. And it tells you that you're full. It makes food less appealing. It quiets the food noise that so many people constantly struggle with. On top of that, it slows down how quickly your stomach empties, so you feel physically fuller for longer. The problem was, our body's natural GLP-1 only lasts for a few minutes before it's broken down. It's a fleeting signal. The holy grail for researchers was to create a synthetic version, a GLP-1 agonist, that could mimic this hormone but stick around for much, much longer. The initial goal was purely for diabetes control. Novo Nordisk, a Danish pharmaceutical company, was a leader in this field. They developed a once-a-day GLP-1 called liraglutide, branded as Victoza. Then they developed a once-a-week version that was even more powerful, Semaglutide. When they started running the big clinical trials for semaglutide as a diabetes treatment, they noticed a very, very interesting side effect. The patients weren't just controlling their blood sugar, they were also losing weight. A lot of weight. Not just a few pounds, but 10–15% of their body weight or even more. This wasn't the primary goal of the trials, but the signal was impossible to ignore. For the researchers, this was a jaw-dropping moment. They had been trying to build a better tool to manage blood sugar, and in the process they had stumbled upon what looked like the most effective weight loss medication in human history. This was the pivot point. This was the moment the world changed. Novo Nordisk realized they didn't just have a diabetes drug on their hands. They had a potential solution to the very problem the world had been failing to solve for half a century. They branded their once-a-week semaglutide for diabetes as Ozempic, and it was approved by the FDA in 2017. But they immediately started a new set of clinical trials, this time specifically for weight loss, using an even higher dose of the same molecule. That higher dose version would be called Wegovy. At the same time, their biggest rival, the American pharmaceutical giant Eli Lilly, was working on its own, even more advanced drug called Tirzepatide. It targeted not just the GLP-1 receptor, but another gut hormone receptor called GIP, creating a dual-action effect that, in trials, would prove to be even more potent for both blood sugar control and weight loss. Their diabetes version was called Mounjaro. Their weight loss version would be called Zepbound. The race was on. The fuse had been lit. What came next would be an explosion unlike anything the pharmaceutical industry and American society had ever seen. The first tremors weren't felt in doctors' offices or pharmacy chains. They were felt on the red carpets of Hollywood and in the curated feeds of Instagram. It started as a whisper, a rumor passed around at after-parties and in exclusive group chats. An actor, famous for his dad bod, suddenly appears on a late-night show looking lean and chiseled. A reality TV star whose entire brand was built on her curvaceous figure posts a vacation photo looking startlingly slender. The denials were swift and predictable. "It's the gym," they'd say. "I just stopped drinking soda. I have a new personal chef." But the public wasn't buying it. A new phrase entered the lexicon: Ozempic face. A term for the gaunt, slightly aged look that can come with rapid weight loss. TikTok became a hotbed of speculation, with users creating video essays, pointing out before and after photos, becoming digital detectives in a high-stakes game of guess who's on the needle. It was a cultural phenomenon, a national obsession. The secret was out, and it wasn't just for the rich and famous anymore. It was for your neighbor, your coworker, your cousin who suddenly dropped 30 pounds before a family wedding. This social media wildfire was the smoke, but the fire itself was raging in a place most people never see: the databases of prescription clearinghouses. These are the digital backrooms of the American healthcare system, where every script is logged, tracked, and tallied. And the numbers they were showing were not just big, they were biblical. They were the kind of numbers that make seasoned pharmaceutical executives, men and women who live and breathe data, stare at their screens in disbelief. Let's put this into perspective. For a new drug to be considered a blockbuster, it typically needs to hit $1 billion in annual sales. Most drugs never get close. It's an elite club. Novo Nordisk's Ozempic wasn't just knocking on the door of the club, it was taking a battering ram to it. In early 2021, weekly new prescriptions for Ozempic in the United States were hovering around 55,000 to 60,000, a very respectable number for a diabetes drug. But as the Hollywood whispers grew louder and the TikToks went viral, something unprecedented happened. By the start of 2022, that number had doubled to over 120,000 new prescriptions a week. By summer, it was pushing 200,000. By the end of the year, it was screaming past 300,000 new prescriptions. Every single week. That's like the entire population of Cincinnati or Pittsburgh starting a new medication every 7 days. And this was on top of the millions of people already taking it. The growth wasn't a line. It was a sheer cliff face. And then came the challenger. Eli Lilly's Mounjaro hit the market in the summer of 2022. It entered a world that Ozempic had already primed. The public was not only aware of these drugs, they were ravenous for them. Mounjaro didn't have to build a fire. It just had to pour gasoline on an existing inferno. Its launch was, by every metric, the most successful pharmaceutical launch in history for its class. In its first 4 months on the market, it captured over 30% of new prescriptions, a feat that would normally take years. While it took Ozempic over 2 years to hit 100,000 new weekly prescriptions, Mounjaro was threatening to do it in less than 6 months. The data revealed a fascinating battle. You could see it week by week. Ozempic, the established king with its massive brand recognition, continued its relentless climb. But Mounjaro, the powerful newcomer, was taking huge bites out of its growth. Doctors were seeing the clinical trial data, which suggested Mounjaro was even more effective for both blood sugar control and weight loss, and they were writing scripts. It became the new weapon in the arsenal. The data showed 2 rockets launching into the stratosphere, side by side. Combined by early 2023, Ozempic, Mounjaro, and their sister drugs like Wegovy and Rybelsus were accounting for more than 600,000 new prescriptions a week. The total number of active prescriptions in the United States soared past 5 million, then 6, then 7. The demand was simply mind-boggling. It was a signal, a deafening roar from the American public. For decades, they had been told that obesity was a moral failing, a lack of willpower. They had been sold countless ineffective diet books, useless exercise gadgets, and disappointing meal plans. They had tried and they had failed and they had blamed themselves. Now, for the first time, there was a tool that actually worked. A tool that quieted the food noise in their heads, that made them feel full, that allowed them to finally gain control. This wasn't just about looking good in a bathing suit. For millions, it was about reversing prediabetes, lowering blood pressure, reducing the risk of heart attack and stroke. It was about being able to play with their grandchildren without getting out of breath. It was about hope. This deep, pent-up well of desperation and hope was the fuel for the explosion. The data was just the Richter scale measuring the earthquake. But this kind of explosive, unprecedented demand has consequences. The American pharmaceutical supply chain, for all its sophistication, is a massive, slow-moving battleship, not a speedboat. It's designed for predictable, steady growth, not for a vertical launch. And it began to break. The first reports were sporadic. A patient in Ohio calls their pharmacy to refill their Ozempic and is told, "Sorry, we're out of stock. We don't know when we're getting more." Then, it was a pharmacist in California telling a patient the same thing about Mounjaro. Soon it was a national crisis. The word shortage became permanently attached to the names Ozempic and Mounjaro. The very success of the drugs had made them impossible to get for many of the people who needed them most. Imagine being a type 2 diabetic patient who has finally gotten your blood sugar under control for the first time in years, only to be told your medication is unavailable. The panic was real. People were calling dozens of pharmacies, driving to neighboring towns, sometimes to other states, desperately searching for their life-altering medicine. Online forums filled with frantic posts. Anyone know a pharmacy in North Dallas with the 1 milligram pen? Willing to trade 2 boxes of 0.5 milligrams for 1 box of 1 milligram. It was chaos. The manufacturers, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, were running their production facilities 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. They were investing billions in new plants. But they were trying to fill an ocean with a garden hose. The demand curve they had planned for over 5 years was happening in 5 months. They simply could not make the stuff fast enough. This created a dangerous vacuum. Because whenever there is immense demand for a product that is in short supply, a shadow economy begins to form. The official regulated channels were failing to meet the need, and an unregulated, unpredictable, and often perilous alternative was starting to emerge. The numbers were staggering. The demand was insatiable. But as pharmacies ran dry and a black market began to stir in the shadows, a critical question started to be asked. In the mad rush for these miracle drugs, who was being left behind? And what was the true cost of this revolution? The answer to that question began to surface not in corporate boardrooms or celebrity interviews, but in the frantic phone calls flooding endocrinology offices and the desperate posts appearing in online diabetes support groups. The people being left behind were the very ones the drug was designed for in the first place. For every new user celebrating their weight loss journey on TikTok, there was a type 2 diabetic patient, somewhere in America, staring at an out-of-stock notice from their local pharmacy. Imagine for a moment you're one of them. For years you've battled a chronic disease. You've managed your diet, pricked your finger daily, and struggled to keep your blood sugar, your A1C levels under control. Your doctor finally prescribes Ozempic, and for the first time things start to click. Your A1C drops into a healthy range. You lose a bit of weight, which helps with your insulin sensitivity. Your risk of heart attack, stroke, or kidney failure, the terrifying specters of uncontrolled diabetes, begins to recede. This isn't a vanity project. It's a lifeline. Then one month you go for your refill and the pharmacist shakes their head. Sorry, it's on backorder. We have no idea when we'll get more. Panic sets in. You call other pharmacies. Same story. Your doctor tries to switch you to a different medication, but it doesn't work as well. Your blood sugar starts to creep up again. The stability you fought so hard for is gone, snatched away by a tidal wave of demand you had nothing to do with. This wasn't a hypothetical scenario. It was the lived reality for hundreds of thousands of Americans. The public data began to paint a startling picture of this internal displacement. Pharmacy analytics firms like IQVIA started tracking prescription trends, and the numbers were staggering. While prescriptions from endocrinologists, the specialists who treat diabetes, remained relatively stable, prescriptions from a completely different set of providers skyrocketed. We saw a massive surge in scripts written by telehealth startups specializing in weight loss, by so-called med spas, and by general practitioners catering to patients explicitly asking for the drug for its off-label use. The data revealed a fundamental shift in who was getting the drug. It was no longer primarily a medical necessity for a specific patient population. It had become the hottest consumer wellness product on the market. The FDA officially added semaglutide to its drug shortages list in 2022, a formal acknowledgement of a crisis that patients had been screaming about for months. This wasn't a minor supply chain hiccup. This was a system-wide failure, where the non-urgent desires of a massive new market were actively preventing the urgent medical needs of the original patients from being met. And into this vacuum of scarcity and desperation, a new industry began to flourish: compounding pharmacies. Now, compounding pharmacies have a legitimate and vital role in medicine. They create custom medications for patients who might be allergic to a specific dye or filler in a commercial drug, or for a child who needs a medication in a liquid form instead of a pill. They are the bespoke tailors of the pharmaceutical world. Under federal law, during a drug shortage, compounders are legally allowed to replicate a medication to ensure patient access. It's a crucial safety valve in the system. But the Ozempic shortage created a loophole the size of a freight train. Suddenly, dozens, then hundreds of compounding pharmacies across the country began advertising that they had the solution: their own version of semaglutide. For a few $100s a month, no insurance necessary, they could ship it right to your door. This was the birth of the gray market. Seemed like a perfect answer. The manufacturer can't keep up? No problem, we'll make it ourselves. But here's the critical and frankly terrifying detail that the public data began to uncover. The semaglutide being used by many of these compounders was not the same active pharmaceutical ingredient used by Novo Nordisk. The FDA issued a stark warning. They had received reports that compounders were using different salt forms of semaglutide, specifically semaglutide sodium and semaglutide acetate. These are raw ingredients, often sourced from overseas labs with little oversight, intended for research purposes only. What are known as research-grade chemicals. They have not been tested for safety or efficacy in humans. The FDA stated unequivocally that these salt forms are different active ingredients from the one used in the approved drugs. They warned of the potential for contamination, incorrect dosages, and unknown side effects. Essentially, people were injecting themselves with a substance that was not Ozempic. It was a molecular cousin, an unvetted chemical copy, created in a lab that wasn't subject to the same rigorous FDA inspections as a major pharmaceutical plant. The data from poison control centers began to reflect this. Reports started trickling in of adverse events linked to compounded semaglutide: severe nausea, vomiting, and in some cases, unexpected side effects that doctors couldn't explain because they didn't know exactly what their patients were taking. Yet the demand was so powerful, the promise so alluring, that millions of Americans were willing to take that risk. This created a profound and disturbing two-tiered system. On one side, you had insured diabetic patients following the rules, unable to get their FDA-approved, clinically tested medication. On the other, you had a cash-paying clientele, able to bypass the system entirely and access a substance of unknown quality and safety from a loosely regulated corner of the market. The cost was the great divider. A monthly supply of Ozempic or Wegovy, without insurance, could run over $1,000. The compounded versions were often available for a third of that price. This economic pressure was immense. It pushed people who couldn't get insurance coverage, or who couldn't afford the brand name price, toward these riskier alternatives. The public prescription data showed this split clearly. The zip codes with the highest rates of brand name prescriptions were often affluent, while anecdotal evidence and reporting suggested the compounded market thrived everywhere else. This wasn't just a story about a drug anymore. It was a story about access, equity, and the desperation that arises when a healthcare system buckles under the weight of consumer demand. The original promise of a revolutionary treatment for diabetes had been warped. The conversation had been hijacked. While diabetics fought for access to their lifeline, a new, larger, and louder group was focused on aesthetics, willing to pay cash and venture into a regulatory Wild West to get what they wanted. The situation was spiraling. The shortages were getting worse, the gray market was exploding, and the patient safety risks were mounting. The two companies at the epicenter of this earthquake, Novo Nordisk and their American rival Eli Lilly, were making unfathomable amounts of money, but they were also facing a logistical and public relations nightmare. They were sitting on the most successful drugs in modern history, but they couldn't make them fast enough, and the fallout from that failure was creating chaos. Their next move would be critical. They had to regain control of the narrative, ramp up production at an impossible speed, and fend off the burgeoning gray market. And in the background, a new, even more powerful drug was waiting in the wings, ready to pour gasoline on an already raging fire. The race for dominance was just beginning. To understand what happened next, we have to look to Indianapolis, to the headquarters of a 150-year-old pharmaceutical giant, Eli Lilly. For decades, Lilly had been a titan in the world of diabetes treatment. They were the first company to commercialize insulin back in the 1920s. They understood this space better than almost anyone, and they had been watching Novo Nordisk's meteoric rise with intense interest, because they had an ace up their sleeve, a compound called Tirzepatide, while Semaglutide, the active ingredient in Ozempic and Wegovy, was a breakthrough. It worked by mimicking a single gut hormone called GLP-1. This hormone tells your brain you're full, and helps your pancreas release insulin. It was revolutionary. But Lilly's scientists had a hypothesis. What if one hormone wasn't the whole story? What if they could create a drug that targeted two? Their research led them to a second hormone, GIP. Think of it this way. If GLP-1 is a key that unlocks the door to feeling full, GIP is a second different key that unlocks another door, one that improves how your body processes sugar and fat. Lilly's Tirzepatide was the first drug of its kind, a dual agonist, designed to press both of these powerful metabolic buttons at the same time. It was, in theory, a one-two punch that a single agonist like semaglutide couldn't match. First, they brought it to market for type 2 diabetes under the brand name Mounjaro, getting FDA approval in May of 2022. The results from its clinical trials were already turning heads. But the real earthquake was coming from their weight loss trials, a series of studies known as the SURMOUNT program. When the data from SURMOUNT-1 was published, it sent a shockwave through the medical and financial communities. The numbers were staggering. At the highest dose, patients taking Tirzepatide lost, on average, nearly 22.5% of their body weight. Let's put that in perspective. The 15% average weight loss seen with Wegovy was already considered a paradigm shift, a game changer. Eli Lilly had just revealed a drug that, according to the data, was potentially 50% more effective. This wasn't just an improvement, it was a leap forward. It was like one company inventing the jet engine while the other was still perfecting the propeller. And Eli Lilly had learned from watching Novo Nordisk. They saw the shortages. They saw the off-label frenzy. They saw the cultural explosion. They had a front-row seat to the entire playbook, and they were determined not to repeat the same mistakes. As Mounjaro prescriptions for diabetes began to climb, a familiar pattern emerged in the public data. A significant percentage of those prescriptions weren't for diabetics. Doctors and patients were already going off-label, hungry for the next, even more powerful solution. The public search data tells a fascinating story. If you chart Google searches for Mounjaro from its launch in mid-2022, you see a rapid steep ascent that starts to rival the search volume for Ozempic. The public was catching on fast. Social media was buzzing. The narrative was no longer just about Ozempic. It was about this new drug, Mounjaro, that the data suggested worked even better. Eli Lilly executed its strategy with near-perfect precision. They spent the next year and a half ramping up production, building a massive stockpile. They were preparing for a war, and they weren't going to show up without ammunition. They knew the demand for a dedicated weight loss version would be astronomical, and they prepared for it. Then, in November 2023, the FDA gave its official approval. Tirzepatide for chronic weight management would be sold under the brand name Zepbound. The launch was immediate and aggressive. Unlike the slow, problem-plagued rollout of Wegovy, Zepbound hit the market like a thunderclap. Prescription data from the first few months is breathtaking. Where Wegovy's launch was a gradual slope hampered by supply issues, Zepbound's was a near vertical line. In its first month on the market, Zepbound grabbed over a third of the market for new prescriptions of obesity drugs. Within 3 months, it had overtaken Wegovy in total weekly prescriptions. The data reveals a classic market disruption. Eli Lilly didn't just enter the race. They redefined it. Their marketing was sharp, their supply chain was ready, and their product, backed by superior clinical data, was undeniably compelling. They launched a direct-to-consumer ad campaign that spoke directly to the frustrations of people who had struggled with diet and exercise alone, positioning Zepbound not as a vanity drug, but as a legitimate medical treatment for a complex, chronic disease. The public response, as seen in the data, was overwhelming. Online forums and social media groups that were once dominated by Ozempic talk were now flooded with posts about Zepbound. People shared their Zepbound journey. They compared side effects and, most importantly, they shared weight loss results that often exceeded what was seen with Wegovy. The anecdotal evidence pouring onto the internet seemed to confirm what the clinical trials had promised. This created a feedback loop. The stunning prescription data led to more media coverage. More media coverage fueled more public interest, which you can see reflected in the near-instantaneous spike in Google searches for Zepbound that dwarfed Mounjaro's initial peak. This interest drove more patients to ask their doctors for it, which in turn pushed the prescription numbers even higher. Eli Lilly had successfully poured gasoline on the fire Novo Nordisk had started. They had taken the cultural phenomenon of Ozempic and amplified it with a product that, on paper and in practice, appeared to be the new king. The rise of Ozempic was a demand-driven explosion born from a viral social media moment. The rise of Zepbound was different. It was a perfectly executed strategic assault, backed by powerful data and a public that was already educated, primed, and desperate for the best possible option. The two Danish and American giants were now locked in a head-to-head battle for a market projected to be worth over $100 billion a year. But this corporate clash, while fascinating, was creating a monumental new problem. With two incredibly effective and incredibly expensive blockbuster drugs now vying for dominance, the entire American healthcare system was being backed into a corner. The staggering demand and the high price tags were about to collide with the cold, hard reality of budgets and balance sheets, forcing a question that nobody had a good answer for. Who exactly was going to pay for all this? The answer, it turned out, was a chaotic, high-stakes game of hot potato played by employers, insurance companies, and the government, with patients caught in the middle. This wasn't just about writing a prescription. It was about navigating a labyrinth designed with one primary goal: cost containment. The moment these drugs moved from a niche diabetes treatment to a mainstream weight loss phenomenon, they slammed headfirst into the intricate, often maddening architecture of the American healthcare system. Let's start with the employers. For a large company, the health of its workforce is a strategic asset, but it's also one of its biggest expenses. When GLP-1s arrived, they presented a brutal paradox. On one hand, obesity is linked to a host of expensive chronic conditions: diabetes, heart disease, joint problems. A drug that could significantly reduce obesity looked like a fantastic long-term investment. Healthier employees mean lower healthcare costs down the road, right? But that's the long term. In the short term, employers were looking at an immediate catastrophic budget explosion. Imagine you're a CEO with 10,000 employees. Data from benefits consultant Siegel showed that in 2023, spending on these drugs for employers skyrocketed by over 500%. A report from the International Foundation of Employee Benefit Plans revealed that for some companies, just these 2 or 3 drugs were on track to consume 20 to 30% of their entire pharmacy budget. It was like suddenly being told you had to buy a brand new Honda Accord for every single employee who wanted one every single year. The math was terrifying. So, the people who pay the premiums, the employers, turned to the people who manage the risk, the insurance companies. And the insurance companies did what they do best: they built walls. They are not villains in this story, not exactly. Their business is managing immense financial risk. If they paid for every single person who qualified for Ozempic or Zepbound based on BMI alone, the entire system would buckle. So they deployed a powerful arsenal of what they call utilization management tools, and what patients call bureaucratic nightmares. The first wall is the formulary. This is the official list of drugs an insurance plan will cover. Insurers and their partners, the pharmacy benefit managers or PBMs, decide what gets on the list and on what tier. A drug on a low tier might have a $20 copay. A drug on a high tier, a non-preferred tier, could cost the patient hundreds, even if it's technically covered. Many plans initially placed Ozempic and Wegovy on these higher tiers, a soft denial designed to discourage use through high costs. But for those who could still afford it, or for whom the need was great, the next wall was even higher: prior authorization. This is the process where your doctor has to formally petition the insurance company, arguing why you specifically need this exact drug. It's not a simple form. It's a demand for extensive documentation. Lab results, chart notes, a history of failed treatments. The doctor has to prove that the patient has tried and failed with other, cheaper alternatives first, a strategy called step therapy. You want the revolutionary new drug? First, you have to prove you've suffered through months on the old ones that didn't work. Public data on prior authorization denial rates is notoriously difficult to centralize, but reports from organizations like the American Medical Association consistently show that these requests are a massive administrative burden on doctors, and a significant percentage are initially denied. Each denial is a win for the insurer's bottom line. For the patient, it's a soul-crushing delay. It's your doctor saying you need this, and a faceless administrator hundreds of miles away, who has never met you, saying, "No, not yet. Prove it again." And pulling the strings behind all of this, standing between the drug makers and the insurers, are the most powerful and least understood players in the entire pharmaceutical ecosystem: the pharmacy benefit managers. Three giant companies, CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and OptumRx, control roughly 80% of the market. They are the ultimate middlemen. Their stated job is to negotiate down drug prices for their clients, the insurance plans, and large employers. But their business model is incredibly opaque. They make money from the spread, the difference between what they charge the insurance plan and what they pay the pharmacy. They also get huge rebates from drug manufacturers in exchange for giving a drug prime placement on the formulary. This creates bizarre incentives. A PBM might favor a more expensive drug with a high list price if the manufacturer gives them a massive secret rebate over a cheaper drug with a smaller rebate. They are the architects of the formulary, the designers of the prior authorization maze. When you're fighting for coverage, you're not just fighting an insurance company. You're fighting a system designed by a PBM to control costs and maximize their own profit. Now, this battle between overwhelming demand and systemic gatekeeping wasn't just a theoretical concept. It played out in a dramatic real-world case study that sent shockwaves through the industry: the state of North Carolina. The North Carolina State Health Plan, which covers over 700,000 teachers, state employees, and retirees, is a massive entity. In 2022, they spent about $100 million on GLP-1 drugs. Projections for 2024 showed that figure was set to explode to over $500 million. And by 2027, they were looking at a cost of $1.5 billion for these drugs alone. The plan was facing insolvency. So, in late 2023, the plan's board of trustees made a drastic decision. They voted to stop covering these revolutionary weight loss drugs for its members entirely. The backlash was immediate and fierce. Teachers, state troopers, and public workers flooded the board with emotional testimony. They weren't using these drugs for vanity. They were using them to reverse diabetes, to get off blood pressure medication, to be able to play with their grandchildren. They felt betrayed. This public outcry forced the board to reverse its decision, but it laid bare the central, unsustainable conflict. Here was a government-run health plan, responsible for the well-being of its public servants, admitting that it simply could not afford the single most effective treatment for one of the nation's biggest health crises. The North Carolina story became a symbol for the entire country. Every employer, every insurer was running the same numbers and coming to the same terrifying conclusion: The system was not built for a drug this popular, this effective, and this expensive. The irresistible force of patient demand had met the immovable object of healthcare economics. And as the official channels became clogged and fortified, as prior authorizations were denied and coverage was dropped, a predictable thing began to happen. People started looking for a way around the walls. The official, regulated, multi-billion-dollar market had created so much friction and frustration that it was about to spawn a shadow industry, one that operated in the gray zones of the law, promising the same results without the gatekeepers, but with a whole new set of risks. This shadow industry wasn't born in back alleys or on the dark web. It emerged from a perfectly legal and often essential corner of the American healthcare system: the compounding pharmacy. For decades, compounding pharmacies have served a vital role. If you're allergic to a dye in a specific pill, a compounder can remake it for you without the dye. If your child can't swallow a pill, they can reformulate it into a liquid. They are the custom tailors of the pharmaceutical world, creating bespoke medications for individual patient needs, operating under the authority of state pharmacy boards. And crucially, they operate under a specific set of federal rules. The FDA generally allows compounding pharmacies to replicate a commercially available drug only under one specific condition: if that drug is on the official FDA drug shortage list. And throughout 2022 and 2023, Ozempic and Wegovy were, for all practical purposes, permanent residents on that list. The demand, fueled by a viral firestorm, had completely overwhelmed the supply chain. Novo Nordisk simply couldn't make the pens fast enough. And in doing so, they inadvertently unlocked the door for a parallel market to spring into existence. The shortage was the legal loophole. It was the crack in the dam, and an ocean of unmet demand was pressing against it. Suddenly, a new ecosystem began to explode online: telehealth startups, many of which had popped up overnight, blanketed social media with ads. Their pitch was seductively simple: no more fighting with your insurance, no more begging your doctor, no more paying $1,600 a month. Just fill out a quick online questionnaire, have a brief virtual consultation, sometimes with a real doctor, sometimes with a nurse practitioner, and for a few $100s a month, a vial of semaglutide would be shipped directly to your door from a compounding pharmacy. For millions of people who had been shut out of the system, this felt like a revolution. It was the democratization of a miracle drug. Facebook groups, once filled with complaints about insurance denials and pharmacy stockouts, transformed into forums for sharing discount codes for telehealth services and tips on which compounding pharmacies ship the fastest. TikTok influencers, who had previously been unboxing their Wegovy pens, were now demonstrating how to draw a precise dose from a small glass vial into an insulin syringe. The friction was gone. The gatekeepers had been bypassed. The solution, it seemed, was just a credit card payment away. But what exactly was in those vials? This question would become the dark heart of the compounding controversy. When you get a Wegovy or Ozempic pen, you are getting a product that has undergone years of rigorous multi-phase clinical trials. Every single batch is tested for purity, sterility, and potency under the FDA's most stringent guidelines. The final product is a stabilized, pH-balanced, sterile solution of pure semaglutide base, the active pharmaceutical ingredient, in a pre-measured single-use delivery device designed to be foolproof. The compounded versions were a different beast entirely. It was the Wild West. You weren't getting a pen. You were getting a multi-dose vial and a pack of syringes, introducing the risk of contamination every time you punctured the rubber stopper. You were responsible for measuring your own dose, creating a significant margin for human error. And most critically, the source and nature of the active ingredient itself came under intense scrutiny. To cut costs and navigate complex supply chains, many of these operations weren't using the pharmaceutical-grade semaglutide base that Novo Nordisk uses. Instead, they were sourcing something different: semaglutide salts. They would buy industrial-grade powders of semaglutide sodium or semaglutide acetate, often from overseas chemical suppliers, and then mix them into a solution. The problem? The FDA came out with a blistering warning, stating that these salt forms are chemically different active ingredients than the one approved in the brand-name drugs. There was zero data on their safety in humans, zero data on their effectiveness. No one knew if they worked the same way, or what the long-term consequences of injecting these unstudied compounds into your body might be. Worse still, the lack of oversight led to horrifying quality control failures. State pharmacy boards began investigating, and what they found was shocking. Some samples of compounded semaglutide had dangerously high levels of impurities. Others had bacterial contamination. Perhaps most commonly, many vials simply didn't contain the amount of a drug they claimed to. A study by the pharmacy benefits manager Express Scripts found that some compounded products had as little as 19% of the advertised strength. People were injecting themselves with a mystery liquid, a roll of the dice in a vial. Some would get a dose so weak it did nothing. Others might get a dose so potent it sent them to the emergency room with uncontrollable vomiting and dehydration. And yet, the industry thrived. It thrived because the desperation was real. Imagine you're a person who has struggled with obesity your entire life. You've tried every diet, every exercise program. You've felt the shame, the judgment, the physical pain. You see people online, people just like you, finally finding relief and reclaiming their lives with this new medication. You go to your doctor hopeful, and they tell you that your insurance won't cover it unless you also have diabetes. The cash price is more than your mortgage payment. You feel hopeless. Then an ad pops up on your phone. Semaglutide, $299 a month, delivered to you. In that moment of desperation, the warnings from the FDA can sound very, very distant. The promise of a solution, right here, right now, can be powerful enough to overwhelm the fear of the unknown. This sprawling gray market represented a direct, existential threat to the pharmaceutical giants. Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly hadn't invested billions of dollars in research and development, navigated the labyrinthine FDA approval process, and spent hundreds of millions on marketing, just to watch fly-by-night telehealth companies and compounding pharmacies siphon off their profits using unapproved versions of their patented molecules. The battle had been fought on social media and in doctors' offices, but now it was about to move into a new arena. The courtroom. The drug makers were about to unleash their legal armies, launching a series of lawsuits that aimed to shut down the shadow industry for good, and in the process, they would reveal just how deep the rabbit hole of compounded drugs really went. The first legal filings landed not like a warning shot, but like a carpet-bombing campaign. In the summer of 2023, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly, in a coordinated but separate series of actions, declared all-out war. They filed lawsuits against a sprawling network of businesses across the country: medical spas in Florida, weight loss clinics in Texas, compounding pharmacies in Tennessee, and telehealth companies that seemed to exist only in the digital ether. This wasn't just about protecting a patent. It was a crusade to reclaim their brand and, they argued, to protect the public. The core of their legal argument was deceptively simple. First, there was the blatant trademark infringement. These clinics were using the names Ozempic and Mounjaro to sell their own concoctions. It was like a street vendor putting a Coca-Cola label on a bottle of homemade brown sugar water. The brand names represented years of research, billions in investment, and a seal of FDA approval. The drug makers argued that these compounders were piggybacking on that reputation, tricking consumers into believing they were getting the real, approved product. The lawsuits were filled with screenshots of websites and social media posts brazenly advertising semaglutide/Ozempic injections, blurring the line between the legitimate drug and the compounded copy. But the second part of their argument was far more alarming, and it peeled back the curtain on what was actually being sold. The drug makers alleged that these compounding pharmacies weren't just making generic versions. They were often creating entirely different, untested chemical compounds. This is where it gets a little technical, but it's the most critical piece of the puzzle. The FDA-approved versions of these drugs use specific active ingredients: semaglutide in Ozempic and Wegovy, and tirzepatide in Mounjaro and Zepbound. However, court documents revealed that many compounding pharmacies were sourcing and using different salt forms of these molecules, primarily semaglutide sodium and tirzepatide acetate. To the average person, that sounds like a minor difference. Sodium acetate, what's the big deal? But in the world of pharmacology, it's the difference between a precision-engineered key and a cheap copy that might break off in the lock. These salt forms had never been tested in human clinical trials. No one knew for sure if they were safe, if they were effective, or what their long-term side effects could be. Eli Lilly's lawyers put it bluntly in one filing, stating that tirzepatide acetate is a crude, unpurified substance used in chemical research, not medicine. They were essentially accusing these clinics of experimenting on the public with research chemicals, all while using the trusted brand names of Mounjaro and Zepbound. To prove their point, the drug companies went undercover. They ordered and tested the products being sold by these clinics. The results, which were made public in court filings, were shocking. One analysis of a compounded semaglutide product found it to be almost 33% impure. Another vial, advertised as containing semaglutide, was found to have a completely different, lower-potency peptide drug. In one of the most egregious cases, a product sold by a Florida clinic was tested and found to contain nothing more than B12 vitamins. People were injecting themselves with a vitamin cocktail, believing it was a revolutionary weight loss drug, and paying a premium for the privilege. The FDA, which had initially opened the door for compounding due to the shortages, now began to sound the alarm. The agency issued public warnings, echoing the drug makers' concerns. They reported receiving adverse event reports after patients used compounded semaglutide. The side effects weren't just nausea or stomach pain. They were unexpected and in some cases severe. The agency warned that they could not verify the safety, quality, or effectiveness of these unsanctioned drugs. The very regulatory body that had created the loophole was now warning people not to climb through it. The compounding pharmacies and clinics, of course, had their own story. They argued they were providing a vital service. They pointed to the endless FDA shortage list and the millions of desperate patients who were either unable to find the drugs or unable to afford them. They claimed they were operating within the legal framework of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, which allows for compounding when a drug is in short supply. They saw themselves not as pirates, but as pioneers filling a market vacuum that the pharmaceutical giants had created themselves by failing to meet the colossal demand. They argued that the salt form issue was a red herring, a way for big pharma to squash competition and maintain their monopoly pricing. But the evidence presented in the lawsuits was hard to ignore. It painted a picture of a Wild West market, where quality control was an afterthought and profit was the primary motivator. One lawsuit detailed how a clinic was mixing its drugs in an unsterile environment, increasing the risk of bacterial infection. Another alleged that a telehealth platform was prescribing the drugs without any meaningful consultation, essentially selling prescriptions to anyone with a credit card. This legal battle was more than just a series of courtroom dramas. It was a crucial data point in the story of these drugs. The sheer number of lawsuits, dozens filed within a matter of months, revealed the scale of the shadow market. It quantified the threat. It showed that for every legitimate prescription being filled, there was a vast, unregulated ecosystem operating in parallel, fueled by social media hype and consumer desperation. The court documents became a public record of the chaos, a detailed account of what happens when a miracle drug meets an insatiable market and a broken supply chain. The drug makers weren't just fighting to protect their profits. They were fighting to control the very identity of their blockbuster products. They had created a phenomenon, but in doing so, they had lost control of it. Now they were using the full force of the American legal system to rein it back in, to draw a hard, bright line between the FDA-approved medicine and the murky world of compounded copies. They were winning injunctions, forcing clinics to stop using their brand names, and sending a clear message to the rest of the industry. But shutting down the compounders was only treating a symptom of the problem. The lawsuits could punish the bad actors, but they couldn't solve the underlying issue that had created them. As long as the official drugs were scarce and expensive, a demand for alternatives would persist. Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly knew this. While their lawyers were busy in court, their engineers and supply chain experts were engaged in another, even more critical battle. A global race against time to produce enough of these miracle molecules to satisfy a world that was clamoring for more. They needed to fix the shortage. And the data shows just how monumental that task would be. To understand the sheer scale of this manufacturing challenge, you have to understand that making a drug like Ozempic isn't like pressing an aspirin pill. That's a small molecule drug. You follow a chemical recipe a bit like baking, and you can scale it up relatively easily. But semaglutide and tirzepatide are not small molecules. They are biologics. Specifically, they are peptides, long complex chains of amino acids. Making them is less like baking and more like farming. You're essentially using living cells, often genetically engineered bacteria or yeast, as microscopic factories. These cells are grown in enormous sterile stainless steel vats called bioreactors, some the size of a small bus. You have to create the perfect environment, the right temperature, the right pH, the right nutrients, to coax these living organisms into producing the exact molecule you need. It's a delicate, weeks-long process. One tiny contamination, one slight deviation in temperature, and an entire multi-million-dollar batch can be ruined. After you've grown the drug, you have to harvest it. This involves an incredibly complex, multi-stage purification process to separate the single, perfect molecule you want from all the other cellular debris and byproducts. Think of it like trying to find one specific grain of sand on a vast beach. The precision required is astronomical. This is high-tech, high-stakes science, and the facilities that can do it are among the most advanced manufacturing plants on Earth. You can't just build one overnight. The public data on pharmaceutical capital expenditures tells this story in stark billion-dollar figures. In the years leading up to the explosion in demand, both Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly were investing, but they were investing based on forecasts for a successful diabetes drug, not a cultural phenomenon that would redefine weight management for the entire planet. The demand curve didn't just bend upwards, it went vertical. It was a statistical black swan event, and their existing infrastructure, as impressive as it was immediately and catastrophically overwhelmed. But the data revealed an even more surprising bottleneck. It wasn't just about making the liquid drug itself. The biggest choke point, the one that truly throttled the global supply, was something most people never even think about: putting the drug into the pen. This process is known in the industry as fill finish. It is the final crucial step where the sterile purified drug is filled into cartridges, which are then assembled into the easy-to-use, pre-filled injector pens that patients receive. This is not a simple task. It has to be done in a completely aseptic or sterile environment. Any microscopic contaminant could be dangerous for a patient injecting the medicine. The machinery is highly specialized, a symphony of robotics and cleanroom technology. And here was the problem. There are only a handful of companies and facilities in the world that can perform this fill-finish service at the scale needed for a global blockbuster drug. Both Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly relied on these specialized contractors, in addition to their own in-house capacity. Suddenly, every major pharmaceutical company with an injectable drug was competing for limited slots on these assembly lines. It was like having an ocean of a new miracle fuel, but only a few dozen gas station pumps in the entire world to dispense it. The public data on drug shortages from the FDA and its European counterpart, the EMA, started to light up. First, it was the lower doses of Ozempic and Wegovy, then all doses. Pharmacists would check their systems, and the estimated time of arrival for a new shipment would be unknown. The supply chain had not just bent, it had fractured. Faced with this crisis, Novo Nordisk and Eli Lilly initiated one of the most aggressive and rapid manufacturing expansions in the history of the pharmaceutical industry. The financial reports and press releases from this period read like a declaration of industrial war. Eli Lilly broke ground on 2 new manufacturing sites in Indiana, a total investment of nearly $4 billion, promising thousands of new jobs. They weren't just building plants. They were building an industrial ecosystem dedicated to tirzepatide. Then they announced another $2.5 billion for a new site in Germany, their first major plant in the country in decades, specifically to boost production of their injectable drug portfolio. Novo Nordisk was doing the same, but on an even grander scale. They announced a massive $6 billion investment to expand their primary manufacturing campus in Kalundborg, Denmark, a project so large it would reshape the local economy. Then came another $2.3 billion for a facility in France, and another $4.1 billion to build a new fill-finish plant in North Carolina, a direct attempt to solve that critical bottleneck on American soil. Just look at those numbers. We're talking about more than $16 billion in publicly announced investments from just these 2 companies in a very short span of time. That's more than the GDP of dozens of countries, all poured into concrete, steel, and bioreactors. But here's the brutal reality of that data. You can't spend your way to immediate production. These aren't software updates you can push overnight. A state-of-the-art pharmaceutical plant takes, on average, 3 to 5 years to build, validate, and receive regulatory approval from agencies like the FDA. Every pipe, every valve, every computer system has to be perfect and proven to be perfect. So while the press releases were hitting the wire in 2022 and 2023, the actual new supply from these megafactories wouldn't start trickling into the system until 2025, 2026, or even later. This created a painful gap, a multi-year chasm between the moment the world decided it desperately wanted these drugs and the moment the industry could realistically supply them. And into that chasm fell millions of patients. The public data on social media tells this side of the story. Reddit forums like r/Ozempic and r/Mounjaro became frantic hubs of communal anxiety. The posts all followed a similar, desperate pattern. Anyone have luck finding 1 milligram in the Bay Area? My pharmacy has been out for 3 weeks, what should I do? I'm supposed to take my shot tomorrow and have no idea if I'll be able to get it. People were sharing spreadsheets of pharmacies, tracking which locations had which doses in stock. They were calling dozens of stores, sometimes driving hours away from home just to secure a single month's supply. This wasn't a hunt for a rare toy at Christmas. This was a desperate search for essential medicine. For diabetic patients, a missed dose could mean uncontrolled blood sugar, a serious health risk. For patients on the verge of life-changing weight loss, the shortage felt like having a lifeline snatched away just as they were being pulled from the water. The companies were racing, investing billions to build the future. But in the present, the shelves were bare, and the people who needed the medicine most were left to wonder when, or if, help would arrive. And for millions, that meant the daily terrifying scramble. Imagine you're a type 2 diabetic. For years, you've relied on a weekly injection to keep your blood sugar in check, to protect your heart, your kidneys, your eyesight. Suddenly, your pharmacy is out. You call another. Also out. You spend your lunch break calling a dozen more. A knot of anxiety tightening in your stomach with each apologetic no. This wasn't a hypothetical. It was the lived reality for countless Americans. Public forums and social media groups exploded with desperate pleas. Anyone in the Dallas area find a 1 milligram pen? Or, my doctor is switching me, but the new one is out of stock too. The data reflects this desperation. Pharmacy analytics firms saw a dramatic spike in what they call prescription abandonment. Not because patients didn't want the medicine, but because it simply wasn't there. The gap between prescriptions written and prescriptions filled became a chasm, a statistical monument to the supply chain's failure to meet a tidal wave of demand. This created a bitter, unspoken tension. On one side, you had people whose very lives depended on these drugs. On the other, you had a new, highly visible group using them for a different, though often equally valid, health reason: obesity. The media narrative quickly framed it as a conflict. Diabetics versus dieters. It was a simple, compelling story, but the reality was far more nuanced. Obesity is not a vanity project. The CDC classifies it as a serious chronic disease linked to heart disease, stroke, and certain types of cancer. The people seeking these drugs for weight loss were often doing so under a doctor's care to address legitimate, life-limiting health concerns. Yet, the optics were powerful. While a diabetic patient was rationing their last few doses, a Hollywood celebrity might be casually mentioning their new skinny pen on a podcast. It felt unfair. It felt like a system prioritizing wealth and influence over medical necessity. And then, even if you could find a pharmacy with a pen in stock, you faced the second great hurdle: the American healthcare system itself. The gatekeeper wasn't the pharmacist anymore. It was your insurance company. The list price for a 1-month supply of Ozempic or Mounjaro hovered around $1,000. For Zepbound, it was even higher. Without insurance, it was a non-starter for almost everyone. With insurance, it was a journey into a bureaucratic maze. The key to this maze was a process called prior authorization. Before your insurer would agree to pay, your doctor had to submit a mountain of paperwork proving you absolutely needed this specific drug. They had to document your A1C levels, your previous medication failures, your comorbidities. It was a system designed to create friction to slow down spending. And for GLP-1s, the friction was dialed to the maximum. Doctors and their staff reported spending hours per week on the phone, fighting with insurance representatives, submitting appeals. For every approval, there were dozens of denials. The denial letters became a genre of their own, filled with clinical, detached language that translated to a simple, brutal no. Sometimes the reason was that you hadn't tried and failed on older, cheaper drugs first, a practice known as step therapy. You had to prove that metformin or glipizide didn't work for you before you could step up to the more expensive option, even if your doctor knew it was the best choice from the start. For weight loss, the denials were even more common. Many insurance plans, especially those offered by employers, had explicit exclusions for weight loss medications. They would cover the gastric bypass surgery, but not the injection that might prevent the need for it. This is where the public data gets truly fascinating and deeply frustrating. We can see the list price of the drug, set by Novo Nordisk or Eli Lilly. But that is almost never the price the insurance company actually pays. Hidden from public view is a complex system of rebates and discounts negotiated by powerful middlemen called pharmacy benefit managers, or PBMs. Companies like CVS Caremark, Express Scripts, and OptumRx. These three giants control nearly 80% of the prescription drug market in the United States. Think of them as the invisible architects of the price you pay. They create the formularies, the list of drugs your insurance plan will cover. They use their immense bargaining power to demand huge rebates from drug manufacturers in exchange for giving a drug preferred placement on that list. So, Eli Lilly might have a list price of over $1,000 for Zepbound, but after paying a massive secret rebate to the PBM, the actual net price the insurer sees is significantly lower, sometimes 50% lower or even more. The problem is that rebate doesn't necessarily get passed on to you, the patient. Your copay or deductible is often calculated based on the high, initial list price. The PBM and sometimes the insurer pockets the difference. It's a system so opaque that in 2023, the Federal Trade Commission launched a formal inquiry into PBM business practices, citing concerns about their role in inflating drug costs for consumers. The drug makers blame the PBMs for demanding ever larger rebates. The PBMs blame the drug makers for setting high list prices to begin with. And while they point fingers at each other, the patient is stuck in the middle, staring at a pharmacy bill for hundreds or even thousands of dollars. This financial pressure cooker was forcing impossible choices. Employers facing skyrocketing premiums to cover these drugs for their employees began to make hard decisions. Data from the Business Group on Health, which represents large employers, showed a surge in companies considering dropping or restricting coverage for GLP-1s for weight loss. They were caught between wanting to provide good benefits and facing a budget-breaking expense that could threaten the financial stability of their entire health plan. The state of North Carolina, for example, announced it would have to stop covering these drugs for its employees after projections showed the cost would exceed $1 billion over 6 years. This perfect storm of shortages, insurance denials, and prohibitive costs created a vacuum. And into that vacuum rushed a new, unregulated, and often dangerous industry, the gray market. If you couldn't get the real thing, maybe you could get something like it. Online searches for compounding pharmacy Ozempic exploded. Compounding pharmacies are legitimate businesses that can, under specific FDA rules, create custom versions of drugs, often during a shortage. However, the FDA quickly issued warnings. They had received reports of adverse events from compounded GLP-1s. The problem was quality control. Some pharmacies were found to be using different salt forms of semaglutide, like semaglutide sodium, which had not been approved for human use and whose safety and efficacy were unknown. It got worse. An entire black market for counterfeit pens began to flourish. People were buying what they thought was Ozempic from illicit online pharmacies or social media contacts, only to receive pens filled with something else. In some cases, it was just saline. In others, it was insulin, leading to life-threatening hypoglycemic shock. Law enforcement agencies across the globe began seizing thousands of fake pens. The Austrian and German health authorities issued urgent warnings after several people were hospitalized from using counterfeit Ozempic. The dream of a medical miracle was, for some, turning into a dangerous gamble. It was a stark illustration of a broken system, where desperation was driving people to risk their health, and even their lives, to get their hands on a drug that promised a new beginning. The question was no longer just about supply and demand, it was about safety, equity, and the very definition of what it means to have access to healthcare in America. And so the Great Divide began. On one side, you had the official FDA-approved path, paved with doctor's appointments, insurance pre-authorizations, and $1,000 price tags. On the other, a sprawling, unregulated digital frontier opened up. A wild west of medicine where the rules were murky and the risks were high. This was the rise of the gray market, an ecosystem that thrived in the shadow of the official shortage. And at its heart was a century-old practice suddenly thrust into the national spotlight: compounding pharmacies. Now, compounding pharmacies have a legitimate and vital role in medicine. They're specialists who can create personalized medications for patients. If you're allergic to a specific dye or filler in a mass-produced pill, a compounding pharmacy can make it for you without that ingredient. If you need a medicine in a liquid form instead of a pill, they can do that too. Under federal law, they can also step in during a drug shortage. If a specific drug is on the FDA's official shortage list, compounding pharmacies are legally permitted to replicate it to meet patient needs. When Ozempic and Wegovy landed on that list, it was like a starting pistol fired for hundreds of these pharmacies across the country. The problem is, what they were creating wasn't exactly Ozempic or Wegovy. They couldn't be. Novo Nordisk owns the patents on the drug and the delivery device, the pen. Instead, these pharmacies were buying the raw active pharmaceutical ingredient, or API, of semaglutide and mixing it themselves into injectable solutions. And this is where the first major red flag appears. A detail that most people desperately seeking the drug would never know to look for. The FDA approved semaglutide in its base form. It's a specific molecular structure that has undergone rigorous testing for safety and efficacy. But many of the raw ingredients being sourced by compounding pharmacies often from overseas labs with little oversight, were not the base form. They were different salt forms, semaglutide sodium or semaglutide acetate. To the average person, this sounds like a trivial difference. But in pharmacology, it's the difference between a precisely engineered key and a roughly cut copy. The salt forms have a different molecular weight, different stability, and most importantly, they have never been tested in large-scale human trials. The FDA issued stark warnings, stating they were not aware of any basis for compounding a drug using these salt forms. They were, in essence, entirely new and unapproved drugs masquerading as the real thing. Patients had no idea if the dose they were injecting was equivalent to the real drug, if it would be effective, or what unknown side effects these different chemical structures might introduce. This chemical ambiguity was just the beginning. The gray market wasn't just happening in local pharmacies. It exploded online. A new breed of telehealth company emerged almost overnight. Their business model was simple and brutally effective. They blanketed social media with ads. Tired of waiting? Get the skinny shot delivered to your door. Weight loss medication? No insurance needed. The process was streamlined for maximum conversion. You'd fill out a quick online form, have a brief, often text-based or 5-minute video call with a nurse practitioner or a doctor licensed in another state, and within days a package would arrive. Inside would be a vial of clear liquid and a bag of insulin syringes. No branded pen, no pharmaceutical packaging, just a label from a compounding pharmacy you'd never heard of. For millions of Americans locked out of the official system, this felt like a godsend. It was a workaround, a solution. The cost, while still significant at maybe $300 or $400 a month, was a fraction of the list price for the brand name drugs. It felt like they were getting the same active ingredient for less. But the data on adverse events began to tell a different story. Reports started trickling into the FDA of infections, unexpected side effects, and in some cases, vials containing no active drug at all, just sterile water. The American Association of Poison Control Centers saw a nearly 1,500% increase in calls related to semaglutide between 2019 and 2022, with many incidents linked to dosing errors from these compounded, multi-dose vials. When you use a Wegovy or Ozempic pen, the dose is preset. You turn a dial, you hear the clicks, and you inject. It's designed to be foolproof. When you're drawing a tiny amount of liquid from a vial into a syringe, the potential for error, taking 10 times the intended dose, for example, is massive. The FDA was caught in a game of whack-a-mole. They sent warning letters to pharmacies and telehealth providers for selling unapproved new drugs and making unsubstantiated claims. They'd shut one down and 2 more would pop up with a slightly different name and a new website. The demand was just too overwhelming. Alongside telehealth companies, med spas and wellness clinics got in on the action. Places that typically offered Botox and facials were now advertising semaglutide weight loss programs, often administered by staff with minimal medical training, in prescribing such powerful metabolic hormones. The allure was irresistible. A quick fix available right now, no questions asked. This created a perilous 2-tiered system of healthcare, a perfect storm of medical inequity. If you were wealthy or had gold-plated insurance, you could get the real, brand-name, FDA-approved drug, manufactured in a sterile state-of-the-art facility. You got the patented delivery device designed for safety and ease of use. You were under the care of your personal doctor, who could monitor your progress and side effects. But if you were part of the other 95%, if your insurance said no, if you couldn't afford the cash price, if you were simply too desperate to wait, you were pushed into this gray market. You were injecting a chemical cousin of the real drug, of unknown purity and potency, sourced from an unknown lab, mixed in a pharmacy you'd never seen, prescribed by a stranger over a text message, and delivered to your doorstep. It was a system that preyed on the very desperation that the drug's success had created. The public data on search trends paints a stunning picture of this digital gold rush. While searches for Ozempic and Wegovy skyrocketed, so did searches for compounded semaglutide, by semaglutide online, and semaglutide peptides. The term peptides itself became a sort of code word, because while selling a prescription drug requires a prescription, some online sellers tried to skirt the rules by marketing their vials as research peptides, not for human consumption, a wink and a nod tactic that put all the liability on the consumer. These were the digital back alleys of the pharmaceutical world, and they were booming. This entire shadow economy raised profound questions. When a solution is dangled in front of people that could radically change their health and their lives, but the official gatekeepers make it nearly impossible to obtain, who is to blame when they seek out a riskier alternative? The patient for taking a chance? The telehealth company for monetizing a loophole? Or the system itself for creating a landscape of such profound inequality? The gray market wasn't just a story about supply and demand. It was a story about access, class, and the painful choices people are forced to make when they feel abandoned by the healthcare system. But while this battle for access and safety was being waged in pharmacies and on websites, the drug's influence was seeping into an entirely new arena. It was escaping the confines of the medical world and beginning to fundamentally reshape culture itself. The conversation was no longer just about A1C levels and BMI charts. It was about celebrity bodies, Hollywood secrets, and a new, almost unnervingly slender aesthetic that began to appear on red carpets and magazine covers. The drug wasn't just changing medicine, it was changing our very perception of the human form, and it even came with a now infamous nickname for one of its most visible side effects: Ozempic face.